The story began with a sketch-style visual showing a young boy named Christopher Robin walking down a path in the 100-acre wood. Before long, he encountered a group of strange, young creatures in the woods. They looked like half-human, half-beast hybrids. Christopher sensed no danger at all. Instead, he let his guard down and approached them to make friends. The creatures introduced themselves. They were Eeyore, Owl, Rabbit, and Piglet, and the most important one of all was called Winnie the Pooh. From that day on, little Christopher started bringing them food regularly. As the days went by, they ate together and played together, forming a deep bond. Through their time with Christopher, these monsters began to act more human. They were like Christopher's friends and family. However, for these creatures, the real nightmare began when Christopher grew up. Once he reached adulthood, he had to leave the 100-acre wood to attend college and study medicine. To focus on his new life, he stopped returning to the 100-acre wood. Without Christopher's feeding and guidance, and with the arrival of winter, the entire forest fell into desolation. The creatures were forced to make a cruel decision. They chose to eat their friend Eeyore, just to stay alive. This act left a massive shadow over their hearts, and the trauma slowly twisted into hatred. They lost all faith in humanity. Their hatred for Christopher, who had abandoned them, ran bottomlessly deep, so the monsters made a pact to abandon whatever humanity they had left and return completely to their feral instincts. They also swore a vow of silence, pledging never to speak again. The story then shifted to 5 years later. A grown-up Christopher returned to the 100-acre wood, hoping to reunite with his old friends. This time, he brought his fiancée, Mary, along with him. As they walked the forest path, Chris led the way and asked Mary if she believed in his talking animal friends. Mary looked at him with a mix of pity and helplessness. She confessed that she found it hard to believe those stories were real. To her, those animal friends seemed more like figments of Chris's childhood imagination. Soon they arrived at the creature's former home. The place that was once full of laughter was now a desolate wasteland. Signs of decay and ruin were everywhere. The whole scene made Mary feel deeply uneasy. She nervously told Chris that something was wrong and they should leave immediately. But Chris remained convinced that his friends wouldn't hurt him. He kept reassuring Mary that they were no threat. As they continued to look around, Mary accidentally spotted a skeleton while Chris scanned the area but completely missed Eeyore's grave marker. Then, they walked toward the cabin where Chris had stayed with the creatures as a child and pushed the door open. Inside, Mary noticed a vandalized drawing. It was a portrait of young Chris, now torn and smeared beyond recognition. In that moment, Chris began to waver. He started to question whether his childhood memories were actually beautiful after all. Suddenly, a noise inside the house shattered the eerie silence. Terrified, Mary and Chris immediately hid and stayed out of sight until the sky turned pitch black. After nightfall, they discovered one of the creatures lying on the bed snoring heavily. Sensing this was their only chance, they quietly got up and made a break for the door. However, just when they thought they had escaped, Piglet suddenly lunged from the shadows. It wrapped a metal chain around Mary's neck and strangled her instantly. Watching his fiancée die before his eyes, Chris nearly collapsed. He fled in a panic and hid in a dark corner. Moments later, he saw Pooh walking slowly toward him. Chris tried to awaken Pooh's humanity, with memories desperately reminding him of the days they played and ate together. But things had changed too much when Piglet appeared from the other side. Chris was trapped between them, surrounded by killers with no way out. At that moment, Chris finally realized that the beings before him were no longer his friends, but completely out-of-control monsters. From that day on, just like many others who stepped into the 100-acre wood, he never made it out of the forest again. Soon after, news about the disappearances in the 100-acre wood began to spread like wildfire. The media kept reporting stories of people mysteriously vanishing in the woods. Reporters went on TV to warn everyone to stay far away from the place known as the 100-acre wood. The story then shifted to the second half and introduced a girl named Maria. She was dealing with a lot of stress, and on her therapist's advice, she was persuaded to take a break from the noisy world and give herself a real vacation. After considering the doctor's opinion, Maria decided to take her best friends to a cabin in the woods for a getaway. They had absolutely no idea that the rental cabin they picked was located deep inside the infamous 100-acre wood. The group of college girls drove up to what looked like a luxurious country house. Seeing how grand the place looked, complete with a swimming pool in the yard, everyone was thrilled. Shortly after they got inside, Jessica suggested that everyone hand over their phones for safekeeping. She believed that since this was a healing trip, being on their phones all day would defeat the whole purpose of the retreat. The girls then talked about how one of their friends, Tina, never showed up on time or always ditched the plan at the last minute. Meanwhile, Tina was currently driving. She stopped her car right in front of a sign that read 100-acre woods and called her friends to ask for their exact location, but no one picked up the phone. Left with no choice, Tina decided to go it alone and walked into the unfamiliar woods. Just then, from the depths of the forest, Winnie the Pooh silently appeared right in front of her. A split second later, terrified out of her mind, Tina turned and ran, fleeing all the way into a rundown, abandoned garage. Once she thought the coast was clear, Tina carefully crept out of her hiding spot. But just as she turned around, she let out a terrified scream. The vicious bear had already sneaked up behind her. He grabbed her tight and violently slammed her head again and again against a wood chipper. Pooh frantically smashed Tina's skull, then brutally stuffed her body into the machine, grinding her directly into pieces. The scene cut back to the villa after getting settled in. Maria opened up to her friends. She told them about a creepy stalker she once had, and how that experience left her deeply traumatized. When Maria mentioned that she was finally starting to feel like herself again, her friends looked at her with encouraging eyes and smiled gently. Meanwhile, in Pooh's lair, Christopher was tied to a ceiling. He kept reminding Pooh of the happy childhood days they spent together. For a split second, Pooh froze. A flashback hit his mind of a young Christopher calling him his best friend and solemnly promising never to leave him. A wave of sadness washed over him first, but immediately that sorrow morphed into burning rage. Pooh grabbed Eeyore's severed tail and used it as a whip, lashing Christopher mercilessly, leaving his former friend bloody and in agony. To make the pain even worse, Pooh took Mary's skull and placed it right in front of Christopher. Seeing his fiance's remains, Christopher broke down sobbing, falling into a state of gut-wrenching despair. On the other side, Lara, who couldn't live without her phone, secretly snuck it back. Later that night, a deranged Pooh was prowling the woods alone. Suddenly he heard blasting music coming from the girls' villa. At that moment, Lara was relaxing alone in the hot tub, taking selfies for her followers on Instagram. After snapping a round of glam shots, she started scrolling through them and suddenly noticed that in the background of one photo, there seemed to be a blurry, shadowy figure. Lara got spooked immediately. She climbed out of the tub to see if some pervert was watching her. She checked the area but found absolutely nothing. Assuming it was just her friends playing a prank, she brushed it off and carelessly slipped back into the hot tub. At that moment, Pooh and Piglet crept up on the unsuspecting Lara and snatched her from the water. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself bound to the front of a car. Standing right next to her was the menacing Piglet, while Pooh sat in the driver's seat revving the engine repeatedly. Lara begged for her life, desperately pleading for them to let her go. But Piglet just gave her a cold stare and signaled Pooh to go ahead. A second later, Pooh slammed the gas pedal to the floor and crushed Lara's head completely. Hearing Lara's blood-curdling scream, Alice and Zoe rushed out to investigate. At the same time, Maria and Jessica also ran outside, only to find the car door wide open and a completely crushed head lying on the ground. Terrified out of their minds by the gruesome scene, the group huddled close together. Then they noticed the glass door, where someone had used bright red blood to write a horrifying message. Before they could even react, the sound of shattering glass echoed from a distance, warning everyone that uninvited guests had broken into the house. They peered outside, trembling with fear, and saw Pooh standing right there, gripping a massive knife in his hand. Pooh circled the villa, looking for an opening to attack. Then he cut the power, plunging the entire house into instant darkness. Zoe and Alice made a quick decision to head to the kitchen and grab weapons for defense, but Maria insisted that this intruder was the stalker from her past. When Zoe and Alice returned, they told her grimly that the thing outside was definitely not human, and certainly not some old stalker. Just then, Maria remembered she had actually brought a gun, so as Maria and Jessica went to retrieve it, the four of them accidentally split into two groups. Meanwhile, Zoe and Alice went to the indoor pool area, intending to lock the back door. Zoe told Alice strictly that if anything happened, she should run and never look back. Barely had she finished speaking when Piglet suddenly appeared. He knocked Alice unconscious immediately, then raised a sledgehammer ready to deliver a killing blow. At the critical moment, Zoe screamed out loud, successfully drawing Piglet's attention away from Alice. Piglet jumped into the pool swinging his heavy hammer and savagely attacked Zoe in the water. When Alice came to, the first thing she saw was Piglet murdering her best friend right then and there. The horrific sight was too much for her mind to handle, and she fainted again. Shortly after, Jessica and Maria arrived at the pool and saw Zoe's body floating on the water. Both were left shaking uncontrollably at the bloody scene. Making matters worse, they witnessed Piglet and Pooh carrying the unconscious Alice away. Jessica and Maria gritted their teeth and decided to quietly trail the bloodthirsty monsters to see where they were taking her. Soon the scene shifted to the demonic lair. Alice was tied to a post with rope, unable to move an inch nearby. Winnie the Psycho Pooh was contentedly scooping fresh honey from a jar and shoving it into his mouth. When Winnie noticed Alice was awake again, he slowly walked over and did something incredibly cruel to her. A while later, seeing that the coast was momentarily clear, Jessica and Maria rushed forward and untied Alice from the ropes. The three supported each other, preparing to flee this hellhole together. Just then, a roar echoed from deeper in the cave. Quick-witted Maria realized immediately that someone else was trapped down there. Inside that rundown shack, they saw Christopher hanging from a hook. Maria cautiously approached his unconscious body. Just then, Chris suddenly jolted awake and immediately begged Maria for help, so Maria and the girls rushed forward to help untie him. As soon as they got him down, they heard a woman's gut-wrenching scream coming from a distance. Chris told the girls to go save her, while he stayed behind the girls, followed the screams, and found a woman covered in scars and wounds tied tightly to a chair. Jessica asked her who had tortured her like this. The woman gritted her teeth and answered that it was Pooh and Piglet. She told them that the bear and the pig could actually talk, speaking in broken English, but usually preferred to do their work in silence. The girls struggled to undo the shackles and chains and freed the poor woman from her restraints. They planned to take her and escape together, but just as they stepped out of the shack, the woman accidentally saw a mirrored wall. When she saw her scarred and disfigured face in the reflection, she screamed in pure terror on the spot. The emotionally broken woman snatched the gun from Maria's hand. This time she chose not to run, but decided to take revenge herself, wanting to kill the monsters who made her this way. Jessica, Maria, and Alice were too scared to fight, so they decided to hide to save themselves. However, when the woman pulled the trigger, the weapon failed to fire, and her plan fell apart in an instant, drawn by the commotion. Pooh arrived and swiftly subdued the woman, preventing her from fighting back. Immediately afterward, Piglet lunged at the immobilized woman and mauled her, viciously tearing her apart and killing her in a savage frenzy. Pooh, enraged, rushed out into the night, after Maria and Jess, leaving the shaken Alice alone in the treehouse. Just then, Alice noticed a hammer on the floor. She seized the chance and suddenly turned to attack Piglet. She grabbed a chain lying around and attacked, wrapping Piglet up tightly and rendering him unable to move. She slapped Piglet hard across the face, waking the monster up, and coldly told him that she would make him pay for all his crimes. But after she raised the hammer and smashed Piglet again and again, Pooh appeared silently out of nowhere. Seeing Piglet's lifeless body, Pooh was furious. He drove the blade straight into Alice's open mouth and out through the back of her head, pinning her dead against the treehouse wall. After finishing off Alice, the bear went back on the hunt. Meanwhile, after running wildly through the woods, Maria and Jessica finally saw a car approaching. Several tough-looking locals stepped out of the vehicle, ignoring how they looked. The girls poured out the whole terrifying story. At first, the men were skeptical, thinking the girls were just drunk, but when they spotted Pooh in the distance, they looked curious and excited, deciding to team up and hunt the beast. Jessica and Maria screamed desperately from the car, telling them to get away, but the men completely ignored their warnings. The four men grabbed their weapons and slowly approached Pooh, surrounding him completely. Logan struck first, smashing a bat right into Pooh's face, but seeing the bear was barely scratched, Logan signaled his buddies to attack all at once. They took turns beating him, but realized the bear wouldn't budge. Instead of being afraid, he only grew angrier. Finally, Pooh had enough and started fighting back. It was his turn to take out these foolish hunters. Seeing Pooh walking toward the car, Maria gritted her teeth and slammed on the gas to run him over. The violent impact jerked her head forward, smashing her forehead against the steering wheel. When her vision cleared, she watched in horror as Pooh physically shoved the car aside and dragged Jessica out of the vehicle. A few seconds later, Pooh walked back holding a severed head. It was Jessica's, terrified out of her mind. Maria tried desperately to keep Pooh out, but in the end, the monster overpowered her. Just as Pooh was about to end her life with his knife, another car came crashing in. It was Christopher. He slammed Pooh from behind between the two cars, saving Maria for the moment. Seeing Pooh pinned between the vehicles, Chris jumped out, ran to Maria's side, and helped her up, but they barely had a moment to breathe. Before Pooh slowly regained consciousness using brute force, he pushed the cars apart and picked up his blood-soaked knife again. This time, he grabbed Maria by her hair and held her tightly against him. Chris begged Pooh once again to stop the slaughter. He kept pleading with Pooh to let Maria go, swearing he would stay in the 100-acre wood forever by his side, never to leave again. Hearing these words, Pooh slowly lowered his knife, seeming to hesitate for a split second, but a second later he finally broke his years of silence and spoke a single sentence to Christopher in a deep voice. Immediately after, he jerked his hand up and slashed Maria's throat open. She slowly died in Chris's arms, but Pooh wouldn't stop. He continued to stab her body in a frenzy. Watching his friend turn into this, a completely broken, Christopher finally realized that the creature before him was no longer the Pooh of the past. At the end of the story, Christopher stumbled alone deep into the forest. The final shot was his fleeing figure and Pooh, still lurking in the darkness, signaling that in the 100-acre wood, the nightmare was far from over.